Hi everyone, this is Chris, and I wanted to talk today in this Hangout about research projects. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the types of projects and what research is versus consulting, and give you guys a chance to think about your research topics and debate that back and forth. We'll see if we go an hour or not. We did this earlier today, and we went a little over an hour. We had a number of people on, so hopefully we'll have the same discussion. So let me just talk about research in general. In my opinion, when you do a research project, whether it's a thesis, research group project, whatever, it's just as important, if not more important, than your classwork, and it's very different. Everything we do so far, and especially in the MicroMasters, what we've done has been very black and white. We give you a very highly designed problem with very tight tolerances, and you're expected to follow exactly the right step to get to something. It's very known, it's very lockstep, almost mechanical. Research is just the opposite. Just like in the questions we've been giving you, there's no gray, it's all black and white. Research is just the opposite. It's all gray, and there is no black and white. And your job as a researcher is to try to pave your way through that and give some kind of order to the chaos. The purpose of research is to try to create new intellectual property, new understandings of things, not to show that you're capable of doing a certain technique. So there's a big difference between homework and research. And so the reason why we make sure you do a research project when you come is because it's a very key element to your education to try to understand unknown things. When you pick your research topic, and we'll talk more in details about that process, you should always pick something that you personally find interesting, because the seventh ring of hell is actually having to work on a project that you don't care about. So you need to make sure when you come here, if you do end up coming to MIT and do a research project, that it's something that you care about and you're interested in, because you'll spend a lot of time. I know in my master's and PhD work, I probably spent 3 to 5x times the amount of time in my research than I did actually in my classwork. So it's much heavier for that. You'll spend more time. And plus, you can use this for different purposes. People have used this to launch companies. For example, Coyote Logistics was launched from a dissertation. I launched part of a product that's used in software companies by my dissertation. It happens a lot, but you can also change your career. You might be able to advance in your company. So there are a lot of things you can do with this research paper and the project to go forward. But at the heart of it, what a research project starts with is a question. And we'll talk about that more in a second, but that's what I want you to start thinking about, is a research question that you want to answer. But when people think about research papers or projects or theses, they always ask, what does it consist of? And we're really flexible in those terms. We don't have a page requirement, a specific approach requirement. We're not going to say write 10 pages on X. We want you to do enough to explain and answer the research question that you posed. And so we're pretty flexible on the content and the format. But you do have to do a couple things. You do have to survey the previous literature or action to see what people have done beforehand, so you're not just repeating something. And you do need to make sure that it ties into some kind of practical application, because we are supply chain guys, right? So it can have some theoretical aspects, but it needs to change or impact practice. And then finally, it needs to make a contribution. It's not just applying network design to a new company. That's not a research project. So when you think of theses or research projects, there's 3 main types that I like to think about. One is modeling. And these are projects where you develop a mathematical representation or a model of the problem, and you use a specific technique, to get an insight out of that. And so we've learned a bunch of techniques in SC0x, different forms of optimization, regression and other econometric models, and then also simulation, which we'll launch next week. And so these are your 3 basic big tools you have in your tool belt. And so for a modeling-based thesis or research project, you'll apply one or more of those to come up with an insight. The second big type of research project or research initiative is fieldwork. And this is where you go out and collect information from practice. You might formulate best practices and lessons. You'll conduct surveys or interviews and case studies, where surveys tend to go very broad, lots of people, very shallow questions. And case studies and interviews are just the opposite. You ask few people very deep questions, and they complement each other. And so the idea of a fieldwork type thesis or project would be where you understand how different companies are approaching the same kind of problem and compare and contrast. And actually, after doing some of that work, you'll probably use some kind of econometric technique to come up with insights, maybe develop a regression model, look at correlations, things like that. And then the last one that a lot of students initially are attracted to, like moths to a flame, are the conceptual ones. And this is where you do a lot of review of the literature and you synthesize what other people have said and you try to put it in a new framework. It's very, excuse me, it's very alluring to people, but it's very hard. And students tend to do a really bad job doing it. And so I try to steer people away from that because, in my opinion, it doesn't really add much to the literature. It doesn't add a lot. There are some great papers out there that synthesize large bodies of work. That's not really what these research projects are going to be based on. So when you're thinking about your projects, you should be thinking about modeling, so using the techniques we've taught you over the last couple courses, and then fieldwork, that's collecting data, not just hard quantitative data, but qualitative data, interviews, surveys, things like that. And so, as I said, the beginning of any research project starts with a question. You want to be able to ask a good question, and then that naturally leads to how would I answer that question, the methodology, the approach that I would take to be able to come up with and answer that question. So some good questions, these are from past research projects. For example, under what conditions does direct store delivery make sense? How can we improve demand forecasting of customized fashion items? How can a company make plans with uncertainty in both demand and supply? How can uncertainty and demand be incorporated in my transportation procurement process? How does the price of trucking firms and the level of service provided interact? So these kind of questions. And each of those questions, you can naturally think about, okay, how would I answer that? Let me give you some bad questions. And these are bad research questions. One is, where should I locate my distribution centers? This is bad for a couple reasons. One, it's mundane because we taught you in SC0x how to do that. So there's nothing new there. And it's only specific to one company. So there's a couple of strikes against that one. What supply chain strategy is best for my company? Again, it's almost an opinion piece. And so unless you have some kind of rigor or framework you can apply, it really doesn't lend itself to being that good or that interesting of a research project. Which software vendor should I select for this function, whether it's ordering, warehousing, transportation? Again, that's more of almost a consulting engagement. So when you come up with a research question, you want to think about it being more open-ended and more generalizable. The biggest problem that I see students, especially older students, have with distinguishing or coming up with a research project is they think it's consulting. And there's a vast difference between doing research and doing consulting. And let me just highlight some of those things. When you work on a consulting project, and I do a lot of consulting myself, and a lot of our students go on to be consultants, but it's very different from research. Consulting projects apply a well-known methodology or approach. You're not doing anything for the first time. You solve all aspects of the problem. You use personnel who performed these types of studies before, and you're expected to come up with a solution that's complete, specific, and actionable with actionable recommendations. So it's specifically answering that company's, that customer's question and saying, here's what you should do for everything you asked me to look at. Research projects, on the other hand, apply a new or non-traditional methodology to the problem that they're facing, focus on solving a representative piece of the problem, use personnel who've not solved this problem in a specific way before, and will usually produce prototypes, guidelines, proofs of concept. So they're very different. Consulting projects look for specific numeric results, while research projects look to uncover insights. For example, if we do a project with a large retailer and I'm consulting, I will want to come up and they want to know how they should allocate their fleet, for example, across their network. If I was doing this as consulting, I would come up and know exactly for each distribution center, for each region, how many truckloads should go to their private fleet, for their contract carriers, for spot. I would solve all that to the number. As a research project, I would want to understand what are the characteristics and what's the framework to help me decide that. And so I want to cover the insight, what is driving the decision of when to use private fleet versus spot, not the exact numerical numbers. Because for research, we don't actually care about the exact numbers. We care about the framework and the insights. Consulting projects result in production-ready tools and approaches. We expect that they're to be implemented right away. Research projects tend to develop prototypes that prove concepts. I've done a lot of projects where we come up with a really robust software tool, but it's a prototype because it is not production ready. The purpose of the research is to do something that hasn't been done before. So it's a prototype of what then needs to be hardened to put into production. Consulting projects are usually time-sensitive. Research projects generally have an open-ended time frame, not always. Consulting projects cover all aspects of a problem, while research projects only focus on the relevant portions. What do I mean here? If we're looking at, for example, how a company, say a manufacturer, should distribute its product across the nation through its DCs, we might, for a consulting project, come up with an answer for each of the DCs, for the whole solution. For a research project, I might scope that down and only look at certain types of DCs, a big one, a little one, and a medium one, and understand the framework and the trade-offs, and then apply that. So for consulting, you solve the whole thing. For research, you look at the relevant ones. You don't have to solve everything. You're coming up with a framework that can then be used. Typically, consulting projects use tools that were once developed in a research project. It moves that way from unknown to research to known to well-used, and then it gets scaled out to consulting. And finally, consulting projects, the results for that are specific usually to a firm, and for research, they have to be generalizable to a larger group of companies and individuals. So I might want to come up with an answer specifically for a company and tell them they need to provide 6 trucks. And for research, it's very much looser and has to be generalizable to other firms. So it'll have to say something that based on certain characteristics, this is what you should do. So hopefully you get a handle on the idea of the difference between research and consulting, because in my mind, they're very different things, and hopefully you're getting a sense of that. So what I want to do now, though, is I would like to actually break you guys up and open up the discussion, the breakout rooms, and I'd like each, when you go into the room, excuse me, I'd like each person in there to talk for just 30 seconds. Don't monologue the whole time, just 30 seconds, maybe a minute, and say, here's my idea of a research question. And it's very important you put it in the terms of a question, like the game show Jeopardy. And the reason why that's important, because one, it's hard, it makes you think about it, but second, it naturally leads you to try to answer it. So how would I answer this question? Because that's the next step we do after a research, after you come up with the question. So break up into your groups. Go to whatever, make sure you spread out evenly as best you can. Come up with a research question, give feedback to each other on yours, and at the end of, say, 10, 15, we'll do 15 minutes till 4:30. Does that make sense, Arthur?
Yes.
Yeah. So we'll go for 15 minutes, and then we'll come back in and use the chat to give me suggestions of what you think a good research question would be. And what we'll do is we'll talk about them. And Eva and I will sit and discuss, what's good. If it's a good project research question, if it's bad, what would make it better, and things like that. It seemed to work well this morning when we tried to critique and give you feedback on the type of projects. And so we'll try and see if that works here. So I'll break up into our rooms, give you 15 minutes, and at 4:30, we'll come back together in 15 minutes. See you in a little while.